All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start seminar now. As you know, I'm not Annie or Alyssa. They kind of dropped this one on me, and I think because it's Scott who's going to be speaking today, they were just like, who better to do this than Alex? I guess they didn't want to ask Tom to do it, but he's here.
Or they just didn't want to listen to my talk.
Well, that too. So we don't know yet. But anyways, for those of you who don't know Scott, Scott graduated from Cornell University with a bachelor's in science in biology. He recently received his PhD in oceanography last year. Right now, he's working with the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute as a postdoctoral research fellow, working on assessing acoustic systems to look at carbon storage and leakages. And soon, January, he's going to be starting his new postdoc at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute with Andoni Lavery and David Barclay from Dalhousie University. So I just want to say congratulations, Scott, because done a lot of cool things over the years, and he's kind of like my academic older brother. So I'm really proud and really excited to hear what you're doing now. So go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. That was a nice intro. Thank you. Right, so like I said, I'm Scott Loranger. I'm working for the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute on a project called Act for Storage. It's looking at geological carbon storage monitoring. So Act for Storage is the acoustic and chemical technologies for environmental monitoring of geological carbon storage. It's a mouthful, but it's a large collaborative project with different industrial, academic, and government partners centered in Norway. The main funder is Gassnova. They're the energy provider, and we work with a large group of people trying to assess the most efficient, cost-effective, and useful off-the-shelf technology for monitoring seafloor geological carbon storage sites to come up with some sort of a plan that could be adopted by sites sequestering carbon. So what do I mean when I talk about seafloor carbon sequestration? The idea is that you gather carbon dioxide from a power plant, maybe from a cement factory, or maybe you vacuum it from the atmosphere and pump it then into the seafloor. Into either a saline aquifer or a depleted hydrocarbon well, some site in the seafloor that you can take that carbon from the atmosphere and put it back basically where it came from, so that it's not in the atmosphere any longer. And of course, this is to address climate change. So this is a plot from the IPCC looking at the temperature change relative to the late 1800s and the cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And these little ellipses here show the concentration of carbon dioxide in ppm. And I think the general consensus is that we would really like to have the temperature change be under 2 degrees, if possible. And so in order to achieve that, we would need to get our concentration of gases in 2050 to 480 to 530 ppm is the idea. And the sort of scary thought is that that doesn't mean slowing down how much carbon dioxide we generate, or staying at the current level we generate. It means decreasing the total amount of carbon that we're generating. So this would be the percent change in greenhouse gas emissions. So not just carbon dioxide, all greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And in order to get to that 480, 530 ppm, we would need to have a pretty significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And that is down at about a decrease of 50% of our total emissions. So how would we pull that off? And there's no silver bullet, there's no one solution to doing this. We need a huge range of solutions. And this is showing the change in investment, basically where we would put our money to address this across different sectors. So you'd have to increase the total electricity generation, increase our investment in renewables, increase the investment in nuclear energy, and increase our use of power plants with CCS. CCS is carbon capture and storage, and decrease our use of fossil fuel plants without CCS. So the question becomes, what do we do with that carbon once we've captured it? Where do we put it? You can put it, there are terrestrial sites sequestering carbon, and there are marine sites. And so we're focused on the marine sites, obviously. And right now, the largest of those is the Sleipner field in the North Sea, which is sequestering about a megaton of carbon dioxide a year, and has been since the 90s. But that's sort of the largest and most significant site. But there are perspectives for other sites. And they're in a variety of different areas. The truth is not everywhere is a good place to sequester carbon, such as the Gulf of Mexico. It's not a great place to try and stuff carbon back into the seafloor because the Gulf of Mexico is super leaky. There's gas and oil coming out of all of those places. So if you want to put this into the seafloor, you want to put it somewhere that isn't going to leak it right back up into the water column. And so our role is to determine if that's happening, to figure out if that gas or dissolved CO2 is coming back out of these sequestering sites. And to monitor that is a pretty big problem. These saline aquifers and hydrocarbon reservoirs are very large. You're talking hundreds of kilometer areas. They're massive. And so you need a multifaceted approach to monitoring such a site. And you have specific sites like where you're injecting the CO2 into the seafloor, the injection well, or maybe a fracture zone, where you're likely to see, most likely to see a leak if it were to happen. And so you'd have a suite of instruments, maybe seafloor mounted, something that is right there monitoring those sites constantly. And then if you want to monitor, you'd have to monitor the entire area because you never know where a leak could come from. You could use maybe an AUV, especially in deep water. If you're in shallow enough water, maybe a towed system or deployed CTDs or something like that to monitor the water column. There's also going to be an approach looking at the seafloor itself. So it'll be seismic surveys looking at migrating CO2 through the seafloor. But we're focused again on that water column aspect. So our project is organized into 5 different work packages, we called them. The first would be the baseline recommendations, where we sort of looked at what the ambient chemistry is in those sites where you're likely to see seafloor carbon sequestration occurring, and what a leak might mean in that environment, what you would need to be able to detect in that area. Then we did some laboratory tests based on that first work package and simulated different leak events. And then we did a couple of nearshore tests in Oslo Fjord where we generated an artificial carbon seep, and that's what I'm mostly going to talk about today. And then work package 4, we went offshore and looked at an analog to a sequestered site seep at a hydrothermal vent. So a hydrothermal vent will leak methane and carbon dioxide, and sort of use that as an analog to a sequestered site. And right now we're in work package 5, which is the data analysis and integration. So a little more on work package 1. We took a look at the World Ocean Database and took a look at the background chemistry and the variability of that background chemistry at likely sequestered sites. And then said, okay, if you're going to have a spill, it's going to be competing with these natural background levels. So it may be this high, it may be that high, and how will it compete with the natural variation, and what are you going to likely to be able to need to detect? And we also did a literature review of AUV and glider markets for sequestered site and what would be the most useful AUV glider autonomous system for looking at a large area. We then took those results and did a simulated seawater event where we took that seawater, did the natural variations, and then also pumped in spiking events for the chemical sensors. So like I said, this is acoustic and chemical technologies. I'm more focused on the acoustic stuff, so I'm sort of brushing over this chemical side, but it's a bigger project where you're going to be using a ton of different instruments to try and monitor these sites. So for the nearshore tests, we did a controlled release of CO2, both as gas and as dissolved CO2. So you're likely to either see gas bubbles, or that CO2 could dissolve in the seawater and be released as a dissolved component. And the acoustics is more focused on the bubbles or droplets, depending on the depth. Talk more about that in a minute. And the dissolved side is more of the chemical instrumentation that you'd use to measure that stuff. We had this really nice setup in Oslo Fjord for the first nearshore test. We had this barge that's part of FFI's work, and FFI is the Norwegian defense group. They have this barge sitting there in this harbor that has power, and it's really nice, stable platform for doing your work. We deployed, this is what the chemical frame looks like, these little frames here. We had a chemical frame as well as our acoustic frame. And the acoustic frame had a split beam echo sounder and a multi-beam echo sounder on it. And I'll talk more about the specifics in a second. And we had our leak frame. This was what generated the leak itself right here. And this was able to generate both gaseous and dissolved CO2 leaks from the barge into the water column. So the instruments we used, the single beam echo sounder was the Kongsberg EK80 wideband sonar. That's a split beam echo sounder that you can run in wideband mode. We used 2 different multi-beam echo sounders. These were run on different experiments. With the Kongsberg EM2040 and M3, those are high frequency multi-beam echo sounders, as well as the ME70, which is sort of a hybrid multi-beam, single beam. And then the more complex system, this SN90, which is a very specialized system that I'm not going to talk about very much, just in the interest of time, but it's really cool if you want to talk about it offline. It's a really neat system. So real quickly, review what the difference is. I don't know how many people in here are very familiar with sonar technology. I know a lot of people are, but real quickly, a single beam echo sounder, one of the main benefits of using a single beam is that with these split beam, single beam echo sounders, it's one beam split into 4 sections, you can determine where a target is in the beam. That's really important for measuring what's called the target strength. And the target strength is how much sound bounces off a target. So you can imagine if you had something sitting right here directly underneath your beam, the sound would come down, bounce off that, and go straight back. And you get a lot of sound return from that target. But if your target was out here at the edge, the sound would come down, and some of it might bounce away from that target, and some of it might bounce back towards the transducer. So where your target is determines how much sound is reflected. Now, if you know where it is in the beam, you can correct for that. You can calibrate the system according to where the target is and measure just the properties of the target instead of measuring the beam pattern as a function of your calibration. So that's really useful, but you compare that to a multi-beam, which is very obviously multiple beams. So your single beam would be one beam right here, right? And a multi-beam has a wide range, a wide swath, multiple beams, high data collection. You cover a large area all at once. And what that looks like, this is a sideways looking multi-beam from one of our experiments. This is the M3 looking horizontally in the water column. So the instrument, it's a little laggy here. The instrument is down here looking outward. There's this school of fish running around up here. Sorry, the mouse is very laggy. I'll use this. We got a school of fish swimming around. Our leak frame is right here, and you can sort of see this speckly bit right there. That's the bubbles coming in through the sonar. And then out there is our chemical sensor frame. And so this is the multi-beam. Each of these is a single beam recording its own time series. And so you get a wide coverage of data. If you were to compare that to the single beam would just cover this region with one single beam. So you get less coverage, but that calibratable part of the single beam is really important for quantifying and differentiating between targets and stuff like that. So they both have their uses. And then a real quick overview there. It's tough to put something up like this in front of a lot of people that know a ton about sonars because there's exceptions to every rule. So someone's probably gonna have something to say about this chart. Looking at Tom. But this is sort of generally true about these systems. The multi-beam echo sounders, you get that wide swath. They tend to be narrow band, so it's a narrow range of frequencies that you're using. But they definitely have that high coverage. That's what they're useful for, is covering a large area of the seafloor at once, or the water column at once. The single beam echo sounder, while not a wide swath, has that calibratable beam pattern. It can be run in broadband mode, which is really important. You can use a wide range of frequencies, which is really helpful, and we'll talk about that. And it has a high dynamic range. So with CO2 bubbles and droplets, what's really neat is that when you get below about 600 meters, that CO2 bubble turns into a liquid. And so liquid droplets don't scatter sound as efficiently as a gas bubble at low frequencies. So that high dynamic range becomes really important. If you've got the seafloor in one ping, it's really hard to detect something really weak like a liquid droplet. And that's because of the increased pressure with depth, right? You increase that pressure and it turns into a liquid. The hybrid system has both the wide swath and calibratable beam pattern. It's multispectral, which means that each of those beams has its own frequency. It doesn't cover a wide range of frequencies, but it pings at different specific frequencies. You get improved coverage over the single beam and improved dynamic range over the multi-beam. And then that trawling sonar, that SN90, is a wide swath, narrow band, but it's modifiable. You can inspect all kinds of stuff. It's really cool, but we're not going to talk about that again. All right, so back to our experiment. The setup, this is sort of an overview of what the setup looks like. You've got our acoustic sensor frame over here. The leak frame is sitting here about 70 meters away, and our chemical sensor frames are downstream of that. And so we've oriented the beam so that the acoustics are just above the leak frame. So you're not pinging on the sea surface, you're not pinging on the leak frame, you're just looking at the water column here and just at the bubbles. And you can see that in the echogram. So this is from a single beam echo sounder. So each of these is one ping from one beam, and that's going, again, looking horizontally through the water column. So this is just going horizontally away from the transducer and increasing in time. So you can see the lines from the barge that was sort of there halfway between us and the leak frame, the leak here, which changes in intensity as you change the leak rate, change the number of bubbles, and the chemical sensor frames end up being in the beam down out here. So just sort of, this is what the leak frame, what the situation looks like from a single beam perspective. And we look at the target strength of that beam as a function of the flow rate. And so the target strength, like I said before, is just a measure of how efficiently something scatters sound. And so as you increase the flow rate, increase the amount of gas in the water column, you increase your target strength. We use the noise profile, so we figure out what the background noise looks like to figure out the detection range of these instruments. You take the signal to noise ratio, that target strength compared to the noise, and look at how far away you'd be able to detect something with these instruments. So with the ES70 is what it's called, that's 70 kilohertz broadband single beam transducer. At our maximum flow rate, it's about 2.6 liters a minute, you can get a detection at about 600 meters away. And with the lowest flow rate, you can get out to about 400 meters away. Now, if you crank that up to 333 kilohertz, your range decreases significantly because the higher frequencies attenuate more quickly in the water column. So you end up with a range at 176 compared to 86. So this 70 kilohertz system you might want to use if you're trying to detect things from farther away. You can detect them from up to 600 meters. So maybe this is on some AUV being deployed around there. The 333 could be really useful for a weak scatterer. You want to get up in the higher frequencies for weak scatterers because that's where you get the best response, the highest target strength. And because it's really broadband, you have a really wide range of frequencies, and that improves your signal to noise ratio, so you can detect those weak scatterers. So this one you could deploy closer to a site in very deep water and be able to detect something like a liquid CO2 droplet coming out of the seafloor. We actually quantified the benefits of using a broadband system with the 70 kilohertz system. And we compared that signal to noise ratio in what's called FM mode, frequency modulated mode, which is the broadband version, and compared that to what they call CW, which is basically just a single frequency mode. And we saw that the signal noise ratio was 25 dB higher, which is actually 5 dB higher than predicted, theoretically predicted. And that changes your detection range from 600 meters to 270 if you drop it down to CW mode. So there's a lot of benefits to using the broadband systems. And then if you look at this response, it sort of has two different distributions, the target strength compared to the flow rate. And you could fit those in linear space and find that the flow rate is linearly related to the target strength. So what I mean is that target strength is a decibel, so that's 10 log 10 of the intensity. So if you look at the intensity, if you look at that linear component of that measurement, the intensity is linearly related to the flow rate. But the slope of that and the intercept are different for these two different distributions. Below the low flow rate and the high flow rate, I'll call it. So where is that coming from? What's the mechanism creating that change? And it's, and they're very well correlated, so they fit very well. High R-squared values and low P values. What happening is that we had two different mechanisms for making the bubbles. So the low flow regime, we applied just enough pressure for the bubbles to get down to that depth of water and then be released from the needle. So the force driving those bubbles out of the needle was basically just the buoyant force of that gas. So it had an initial velocity basically of 0. And then if you increase the pressure, so in order to get a high flow in this first experiment, we had to crank up the pressure to get higher flow. You end up having an initial velocity when you release the drop of bubbles, and you have that buoyant force and the force of the pressure behind it. So you have two different creation mechanisms for these two different scenarios, and that results in different bubble size distributions, is the thought. So basically, you have one size distribution here, but as you increase the flow using that mechanism, you just increase the number of bubbles. And then you change your mechanism for making the bubbles, and you change your bubble size distribution. But as long as you maintain that same mechanism and you increase the flow, you're just increasing the number of bubbles with that distribution. So there's one distribution here, one distribution here, and then you just increase the number of bubbles as you increase the flow rate. That's the simplest, like most parsimonious solution. It's not very satisfying because we don't really have a way to measure that, but it's the simplest way. So we did some follow-up experiments here at UNH where we measured these bubbles using a system I'd used for my PhD in the tank here, the tank right over there. So we have our echo sounders in the water column, and we're generating bubbles down there from the bottom of the tank, and they're rising to the surface. We used this thing. This is a calibrated camera system, so you can take an image of this calibration target. It's got 2 millimeter size squares on it, and you can calibrate the size of your pixel. You drive this thing over here, and you release CO2. And you can look at those bubbles coming out of there and measure their size. I use this for my PhD, and I, in retrospect, think that it's cruel and unusual punishment to make anyone use an instrument from their PhD right after they finished. To have to go back and use it again is horrible. So I think you need a 5-year span between coming back to the instrument you used. But anyway, you can see the difference in flow rate. These are those same echograms looking horizontally through the tank now over there. You can see that the intensity increases as you increase the flow rate. This is 0.5 liter a minute and then 4.7 liters per minute with 70 kilohertz, and then with the 333 kilohertz. We used a wider range of frequencies for this experiment, so we actually have coverage. These are how you identify the transducers. So it's a 70, a 120, 200, and 333. That's the kilohertz frequency of the center frequency. So we end up getting coverage from about 45 to 450 kilohertz. We did a range of flow rates and then a range of orifice sizes. So that's the size of the needle you're generating the gas through. The idea being that if we're applying the same backing pressure in this scenario, we should get the same distribution of bubbles, but they should increase in number as I increase the flow rate. Changing the size should change that distribution again, but it should still linearly increase as I increase the flow rate. And we did another to have a little statistical rigor. The idea is that what determines your bubble size, the main components that determine your bubble size is the size of the opening, size of the orifice you're passing the bubbles through, the composition of the gas, what the gas is made out of, and the way you're making it, the pressure behind it, what force you're releasing those bubbles with. So we're going to compare these results to a few models. There's a model by Scott Sokolowski, the V-drop-J model they developed for the Deepwater Horizon, which takes into account all these factors and predicts your bubble size distribution. We'll compare that to our acoustic measurements and to the results from the camera system where we've measured the bubble sizes directly. So that will help us inform whether keeping the same generation mechanism does in fact keep your bubble size distribution the same. And increasing flow just increases the number of bubbles, which is important for the second round of nearshore tests that we did this year. So for this experiment, we changed locations. There's a slight issue with the dissolved CO2. Where we were, so here's where we are. We're south of Oslo in Norway, in Oslo Fjord. And if we zoom in a little closer, there's Oslo up there. And this is the town of Horten, where Kongsberg is located, actually. And we're in this area down here. And if you look, our 2018 location was in this harbor here. We chose it because it was great to have that barge and having a powered barge and all this wonderful support. But the problem was that it's very enclosed. And so it was heavily stratified. And we're generating this plume of dissolved CO2, and the plume is coming up, hitting one of those density layers and just sort of hanging out there or falling back down, which isn't really analogous to what you'd see at a seep site, at a spill site in deep water. You expect that to continue going up and not hit a density layer. So we moved out to the other side of Astoya Island for our 2019 experiments. And this is that acoustic frame I was talking about. We have a 70 kilohertz split beam right here, 333, and this is called an M3. That's the multi-beam sonar. It's actually what we looked at before. We had on shore, these are our tanks of dissolved CO2. You pump the CO2 out to right about where this float is here, and that's where our leak frame is, and generate the plume. And then we use bottles of CO2. They're not shown here, but that's how we generated the gas from the same leak frame. What was really nice about this site was that it was part of FFI and the Norwegian military sort of barracks in the area, and they had drilled through the rock these pipes that went down to the seafloor. So you could run all of your electronics and tubing and everything through these things, get them out of the water column, and they went straight down to the seafloor and connected to everything. It was really nice. Makes cable management so much easier. So it was a fantastic site, and this was nice to have, to be able to go inside and out of the wind. This is what that orientation looks like. The shack was sitting right about here. This is our acoustic sensor frame, very close to the cliff. And then the leak frame and the chemical sensor a little farther offshore. Oops. And you can see that setup. We looked at this M3 result before, right? We're looking out and you see this is the M3 sitting there on that acoustic frame. You can see the plume and the chemical sensor frame, and then our little fishy squad flying around there. We didn't just use the seafloor mounted acoustics. We also did some work with the autonomous vehicles, used the Hugin AUV and Alcimar's Sea Explorer glider to generate a bunch of data. And we did some shipboard experiments. And so I'm going to talk about these shipboard experiments now. They were on board the Simrad Echo, which is Kongsberg's research vessel. And it's really cool. It's kind of hard to make out from this picture, but all of these columns here are rams that go into through the hull to put different transducers on. So this thing is just covered with almost every transducer they make. So you can do all kinds of fun stuff. And that's the only reason we use that SN90, that weird one I'd never even heard of before, is because it was there. So we use the EK80s, those split beam, single beam echo sounders, the EM2040 multi-beam. This is what the ME70 looks like. That's that sort of hybrid between a single beam and a multi-beam. And this is what the SN90 looks like. It's a cube. Again, this is that orientation, right? And so if we sort of turn this image so we're looking straight at that cliff, this is the bathymetry from the EM2040. So this is the cliff up here. Our acoustic frame is somewhere over here. And if we look at the water column data, it's a little hairy, but you can see, can you see it on here? Sort of. You can see the chemical sensor frame there and the leak frame here. And this is our little squad of fishies that hung out the whole time and caused a few issues. And if we turn on the leak frame with air, so we could pump air or CO2 bubbles through this thing. The air was really helpful for finding the frame because it comes all the way to the surface and bubbles at the surface, and then you just drive the boat over there. Turn on the air, and you have this really strong water column seep. Zoom out, and it goes all the way to the very top of the beam. The air goes all the way to the surface, right? As you would expect. If you change that to CO2 at a lower leak rate, it doesn't go all the way to the top of the beam. It doesn't go all the way through the water column. It eventually stops. So your air goes all the way up. CO2 doesn't go quite as high. And if you go to a lower leak rate, it goes even lower in the water column. Right? So what's happening? What happens to a CO2 bubble? Oh, and this was based on a discussion we had looking at this data before, that people were very surprised at how straight up and down these seeps were when there should be a little bit of flow, but that's mostly just the vertical exaggeration. If we drop it down to 1, the vertical exaggeration, no vertical exaggeration, you can see that it's curved and bent. So what happens to a CO2 bubble? The bubble is introduced into the water column, and the CO2 starts to dissolve out. There's a much higher concentration in the bubble than in the ambient seawater, and so the CO2 starts to dissolve into the water column. But the bubble will also start leaching gases from the water column into itself. It'll take in nitrogen and oxygen, that's sort of the highest components, the largest components, as well as like argon and hydrogen and some other minor gases. It's basically the same composition as air, so it'll start leaching those gases in there. And if you were to hold the mass constant, as the bubble rose, it would expand because of the decreasing pressure. So all three of these things act in balance to figure out what happens to a bubble rising through the water column. If the CO2 dissolves very rapidly, the bubble's likely getting smaller and eventually will go away. If you're using something like air, there's not very little gas exchange because the water is almost at the same balance as the air bubble. So those bubbles go all the way to the top. They probably expand as they rise through the water column. So the CO2 is dissolving away. That's why it doesn't go as high in the water column. So this is some data examples using the different sonars. This is with the multi-beam. And to orient you, this is sort of like we're driving along with this fan view going along as we move forward, looking at thwart chips. And you can measure the shape of the seep. You know, it's in this beam, not in this beam, in this beam. So it's this many beams wide in this direction. And you can also look at it driving along this way. I learned how to do animations. It's very exciting. And you can see the shape of this thing going that way. So you get a 3D look at the shape of the seep, and you can figure out how tall it is from this data, right? With the single beam, you don't get that swath version, that athwart ships, across ships view. You only get the along ship view of the shape of this thing. But you do get to use a ton of different frequencies. So we use the 18, 38, 70, 120, and 200. So a huge range of frequencies looking at this thing. And interestingly, the seep height is almost identical across all those frequencies. But you get another measurement of the height of this seep using those systems. And then with the ME70, same deal. What's kind of fun about the ME70 is that each of these beams is a different frequency. So if we look at the 82 kilohertz band, that's just like an 82 kilohertz single beam echogram. The seep came up and sort of bent off this way, and this 82 kilohertz beam is over here. So we just see the top of the seep. This is the central band right here, and you see the seep most of the way up, and then you can see that it sort of goes away, but shows up in the other beam. So you get this nice view of the size and shape of the beam, but it's also a calibratable system. So this could be very useful for looking at seeps, as could the others, depending on your application. What's interesting is the height of the seep. So using the EK80s, we found that the seep was 30-something meters above the seafloor. So this is the height of the seep above the seafloor. Same with the EM2040, same with the ME70, and it's relatively frequency independent. These things are always going the same height. But if you decrease the flow rate, you tend to decrease the height of the seep. And that's a really interesting result, somewhat unexpected. So what determines the height of your seep depends on how you look at that dissolving bubble. There's two different ways to look at a bubble dissolving, being released into the water column. You can look at it as an individual bubble on its own. This one bubble comes up, it rises, it dissolves and takes on gas, and you can model it expanding and figure out where it's going to dissolve away. But the other way is to look and to assume that that seep is just a collection of individual bubbles and model them all as individual bubbles. But if you have enough flow, you can end up entraining seawater into your seep. So you're not just moving bubbles up, you're also moving the seawater surrounding it. And so that surrounding seawater will increase in concentration of CO2 and stick around with the plume. So you don't have as strong of a concentration gradient as you would for a single bubble. So the indication is that we had seen before from our lab experiments and from the previous nearshore experiment that the size distribution tended to stay the same as long as you're using the same mechanism to make the bubbles. And we're using the same mechanism here, we just decreased the flow rate. So the bubble size distribution should be the same. If the size changed, you could see that it wouldn't rise as high. So the size changes the height at which a bubble dissolves, right? A smaller bubble dissolves more rapidly and wouldn't get as high. But if we have the same bubble size distribution, they should rise to the same height. It should just be a weaker return. But we don't see that. We see maybe the impacts of this entrained seawater. You're starting to entrain a lot of seawater at this flow rate, and that means the bubbles go higher. And that could be really important for modeling the impacts of a leak from a sequestering site. So when we designed this experiment, we had some back of the envelope calculations and conversations with people where they were worried our shipboard experiments wouldn't even see the seep at all. And it was a real concern because the consensus was these things were going to dissolve in the first 2 to 5 meters. They're going to dissolve away right away. But we're seeing 30-some meters above the seafloor. And if you look in the literature, there's a very disparate results. There are people looking at natural seeps, finding the CO2 going all the way to the surface. Those natural seeps tend to only be in like 12 meters of water, but they're going all the way through that 12 meters. And then people generating artificial seeps doing similar work that we're doing are, they use a different methodology to follow their bubbles, but they're saying that they're dissolving away in the first 2 to 5 meters, and they're using similar leak rates. So there's a lot to figure out here. What is influencing the height of these seeps? And why is it such a disparate result across the literature? And is it the methodology, or is it actually a difference, and what's it driven by? So there's a lot of work to be done with this data set. We're just starting to dig into it. Just starting to model the dissolution of these bubbles using the two different models, the single bubble and the entrained water model, thanks to Giuseppe, who helped me get that thing going. But we have a lot of work to do. And so with that, hopefully you guys have some questions.
Thank you, Scott. So just for reminders, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
From a functional perspective, like you did things in 100 meters depth water, if this gets up and starts being done operationally, are there limits to the depth at which you can actually store carbon either financially or physically or any of that, technically, chemically, et cetera?
Yeah, so the biggest financial driver of where you're gonna put this stuff is basically, is there already a well drilled there? The most expensive thing is to drill the well. So you're likely to go to a site where there's already a well drilled for hydrocarbon extraction. The Sleipner field is connected to a hydrocarbon extracting platform, and they're pumping it directly into the saline aquifer that sits above that. So financially, mostly you're looking at whether there's a well or not is your biggest driver. Chemically, what happens to CO2 is really interesting. So one of the proposed methods of sequestering CO2 was just to pump it off the shelf. Because when you get to a certain depth, CO2 becomes negatively buoyant. It dissolves in the water column and makes it negatively buoyant. So you just put a big tube out there, drive it out there, and it'll just sink down to the bottom and hang out down there. So a lot of the proposals are to bury this stuff deeper so that even if it were to leak from the reservoir, it may come up a little bit in the sediments, but it's just going to hang out at some layer in the seafloor itself. Or if it somehow made it to the surface, we're down below 1,000 meters, I think, you end up with it just sort of sitting there, is the theory. But it was also the theory that the stuff was going to dissolve right away. And that's what's driving that theory that it would stay down there, that it dissolves in the seawater, makes the seawater more negatively buoyant and sits down there on the seafloor. Sure.
Hi, my name's Patrick, but I was wondering, is it worth the risk of potentially adding like this much more carbon due to potential leaks, as the ocean's already sequestered so much carbon over, this past industrial period?
So the risk assessment is what is more impactful, right? Heating the planet by putting the CO2 in the atmosphere, or sequestering some of that away in the seafloor. And unfortunately, that calculus is mostly what is the impact on humans. I don't know, unfortunately, but that's just the way we have to look at the world, right? Climate change isn't going to change the planet itself. It's going to make it hard for people to live on it. So we're trying to address the human side of it. So taking that out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ocean has less of an impact on humans. The idea with this monitoring program is to make sure it has less of an impact on the ocean. If you can keep it in that seafloor site. And the leaks are not incredibly likely to happen. They're less likely, according to some calculations, than leaks from drilling for new hydrocarbon wells, because these are going to be done through wells that are already established, capped, and holding things in place.
Okay.
So it's the cement has properly sealed. Everything seems to be working correctly already, and you're just retapping into that.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
What about turbidity? You had the, you said you could measure, maybe could detect a plume from 600 meters based on the different frequencies. What was the turbidity of the water you were in, and would you expect you to not be able to detect it as from far of a distance if you were in like a more dynamic environment that had like maybe a lot of tidal mixing or wave action?
Yeah, physical oceanography like microstructures, internal waves, that kind of stuff can really impact your acoustic propagation. Depending on the particle size, turbidity, depending on the particle size and your frequency, turbidity could potentially have no impact on the acoustic propagation. But you're unlikely to see a sequestering site in highly turbid waters. We're talking pretty deep. These are where they're extracting oil in the North Sea or in off the coast of Japan, in really deep waters, where I believe the turbidity would be expected to be quite low. But in highly turbid waters, what would be interesting is that those turbid particles can interact with the bubble and create a layer around that bubble and decrease your dissolution rate. So you could end up with higher rising bubbles just due to the ambient turbidity, due to whatever's in the water column. And they actually model the rise rate either as a clean bubble or what they call a dirty bubble, which is a bubble with that stuff on the outside of it. It impacts the rise rate and likely the dissolution.
We have a question from Liz. She said, Scott, that was an awesome presentation. Question about your second experiment. You didn't have a seep height measurement for the EK80 for lower flow rates. Is that because you didn't see the seep, or the data hasn't been processed yet?
Oh, so this is because we only got a chance to do the EK80 with a leak rate, this leak rate, and we only got a chance to do the experiments with this. We had the Simrad Echo basically for one day, so we just packed as much as we could in one day and drove over the different leak rates with whatever systems we could. So it was just opportunity. We just don't have data there.
Just a quick question on the chemistry. On the bubble, the CO2 is escaping, but at the same time, the gases in the water are getting forced into the bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that occurring?
The concentration gradient. You've basically got a pure CO2 bubble, right? And you've got this dissolved gas around it. And so you're driving it from high to low concentration.
So it's not a function of the pressure of the water inside, outside of the bubble versus the pressure of the inside the bubble, or are they equal? Probably equal.
I think they're equal,
Yeah.
but it's also a function of, again, talking about that dirty bubble model, and this is sort of getting into the weeds, but if you have a clean bubble, you have more internal circulation, so you're actually exposing the outside of your bubble to pure CO2 as it's rising due to the viscosity, so you're spinning that bubble through there. So you get higher dissolution as you change exchange gases at the surface of your bubble. And if you have a dirty bubble covered with oil carbon particles, you don't get that internal circulation, and your dissolution rate decreases. So there is a function of the movement of the bubble, but I believe the pressures would be the same. It's driven mostly by the concentration. Yeah.
So now that you've established that you can get an idea of if the seep is there and if stuff is coming out, you've sort of established that you can survey and find out if your carbon reservoir is actually holding the carbon. I'm wondering sort of what the future might look like. Is it determining what echo sounder might be the best tool to go ahead and do this survey? Or I know you guys are sort of focusing on modeling how much is actually coming out once you detect a seep, but essentially you just want to know, is my well working? And so even if you don't know precisely how well it's working, is that still valuable?
Yeah, so the goal of these results is that there are international regulations for how you should monitor your sequestering site, even though there aren't that many sites yet. And so this is to provide the tools to make sure that you are meeting those requirements to establish that there's nothing coming out of there. So it won't just be one echo sounder, it's going to be a wide range of instruments, right? So the echo sounders are great for detecting bubbles and droplets, not so much if you have a dissolved CO2 plume. There's not enough of acoustic impedance contrast there to detect it. So you're also going to need chemical sensors, and you're going to need them on stationary platforms and on mobile platforms. And so I think the future is a big impact on the future is going to be the advancement of autonomous systems and like self-docking autonomous systems, and whether you can look at this massive area with just a fleet of AUVs that are self-powering and data telemetering and all that kind of fun stuff. Because the instrumentation seems to be doing a pretty good job so far, including the chemical sensors. They can detect pretty low level changes. And there's analogs for the CO2 that you can use, like pH. So that's a thing that you can measure accurately and that you can measure quickly. So some of the measurements you use for CO2, you have to dissolve that gas across a membrane, and then you use infrared light passing back and forth to measure it, and there's a slight delay. That's what we found from our work package 2, simulating a leak. So we found that the pH sensor might be the one you want to use if you're rapidly driving around. And actually, I talked about our 4th package where we were going to go out to use the hydrothermal vent field as an analog for a leak event. And our CO2 sensor wasn't working, but we used the methane sensor, which has the same methodology as the CO2 sensor. It's just a different wavelength, looking for methane as opposed to CO2, and the redox potential, which is derived from the pH value you measure. And we found this plume emanating from this ridge we found it, we were at 2,100 meters depth. And so what you see is this weird flame shape to this. And this is basically the Huygens AUV driving this way and then turning around and driving that way. And this is how long it takes for this thing to come back to zero. That you end up dragging your plume signal as you go along as that gas filters out of your membrane. But with the pH sensor, it's pretty instantaneous. You're just seeing this redox drop, which you would expect with a plume, and just seeing the width of it without as much of a tune down time. So it's sort of directing what chemical instruments you want, as well as what acoustic instrumentation is appropriate for depending on what you're trying to do.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
Were you measuring pH in any of your CO2 release experiments?
Yes. Yeah, I'll just repeat the question because Tom won't follow directions. Tom asked if we were measuring pH during our nearshore experiments, I believe. And the answer is yes. We had that stationary chemical sensor platform. We also had the Huygens and that Elsinore glider that were collecting pH data. So we have pH data both in the seep, obviously not at the same time as the acoustics, but during a similar seep release event. I don't have that data, so I don't know. I'm not the chemical guy, I don't know. Okay, fine. So it's both the concentration and the dissolvability of the gas. but that the only way to calculate how well it dissolves is to know the concentration and apply Henry's law. So you can't differentiate between the two.
All right, if there's no more questions, let's congratulate Scott again. Thank you.